My fellow investors, welcome back to the Newcomer Investor Channel, where we uncover the story behind great businesses. I am very, very excited today to welcome AJ Button or Andrew Button back to the show. AJ has been a guest previously, and he was amazing, and he's one of my favorite people in the FinTwit community. So I thought, let's do an episode again and get an update on all the topics we talked about and more, because I really would love to pick your brain on all this. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Fantastic. I'm doing great too. Thank you. Before we even get started, I do have to remind everyone, obviously, that nothing we say is financial advice. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're just telling you what we're doing. But everyone, of course, is responsible for doing their own research. Yeah, we're all continuously learning. Now, before we get started into all our business topics, I'd love to get a bit of an update on you for our listeners who may not be familiar. Like, give us a bit of an introduction on your journey and your investing style.
Well, I consider myself a value investor. I invest currently in a lot of financials, energy companies I got into recently, and Chinese stocks. And Chinese stocks is really the topic that got me most of my audience on Twitter/X. That includes Alibaba, PDD Holdings, Postal Savings Bank of China. So as far as my claim to fame goes, if there is one, it's Chinese stocks. Yeah, I mean, I'm like an all-around value investor. I used to hold some U.S. equities. I still have Berkshire Hathaway, but I sold my U.S. technology stocks because I felt they were getting a little overheated. So now it's mostly financials, energy, and China.
All right, good. Yeah, you're right about the China stuff. I mean, that's where I first found you. I think you wrote an
Hmm.
article or something, and I was like, oh, who's this guy?
Yeah.
And then I looked you up, and then I followed you. So that's a perfect segue because today I'd love to talk about China. So as you know, a very big topic on Twitter and everywhere is the concept of, is China investable, right? A lot of people will say, well, it's a different system, so maybe not. And some other people say, well, it's cheap, there's value, it's worth it. So I'd love you to kind of break down that debate in more detail and provide your thoughts on it.
Well, the reason some people say that China isn't investable is because China is in the midst of a competition with the United States. And I say competition, not conflict, because this isn't a war. There's not even proxy wars. So this isn't quite a Cold War situation, but it's an increasing competitive dynamic that at times can impose certain costs on Chinese companies. For example, during the Trump years, a number of smaller Chinese companies were delisted from the New York Exchange. Now, as of today, people can still buy those as over-the-counter shares, but they were delisted, and that had a bad effect on their stock prices. Also, some Chinese technology companies are being sanctioned by the United States, and China in general is under chip sanctions from the United States, which means that the United States doesn't allow various types of computer chips, chip equipment to be exported to China. This can adversely affect the performance of Chinese technology stocks in theory because they can't run, let's say, next-gen AI models with as much processing power and as much speed as a result as US technology companies can. So, for example, NVIDIA is not allowed to ship their most advanced GPUs to China.
Hmm.
ASML and Taiwan Semiconductor are restricted in what they can ship to China. And you might say ASML, TSMC, these aren't U.S. companies. How's the U.S. restricting that? Well, the U.S. has worked out deals with the governments that those countries are based in to restrict their companies from shipping semiconductor manufacturing equipment, completed semiconductors to China. So that's a risk to all of the Chinese technology companies. And there is also the matter of the tail risk implied by a future China-Taiwan conflict. In the event of a conflict between China and Taiwan, militarily, China is the stronger country. However, most U.S. military experts don't think they have the capacity to take the island of Taiwan right now. Certainly, some Taiwanese companies could be directly physically impacted, like facilities destroyed, things like that. However, the really big risk to investors in mainland Chinese stocks in this scenario is the possibility of capital controls on either the Chinese side or the US side. So let's say, for example, that a war between China and Taiwan break out. breaks out. And it goes basically exactly like how a war between Russia and Ukraine went, which is to say there were lots of sanctions put on China. Chinese stocks delisted from the US stock exchanges. China retaliates and does something similar to what Russia did, which is either deny the payment of dividends to foreign shareholders or not even, or basically just disallow foreign shareholders from trading on the Hong Kong exchange. In this particular scenario, where there's a war between China and Taiwan and there are extreme capital controls from both sides, then effectively your Chinese shares are, at least for as long as the war is going on, kind of like worthless. So why do I just outlined this like laundry list of risks? And so why do I invest in China despite all of this? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, Chinese stocks, as a result of all the perceived risk, trade much, much, much more cheaply. And I mean way more cheaply than comparable U.S. equities. I mean, if you look at the big Chinese technology stocks, Alibaba, PDD Holdings, they're averaging around 10 times earnings. The U.S.
insane.
technology,
Yeah.
the U.S. technology sector is more like 30.
30.
As a result of this cheapness, they're able to buy back very high percentages of their shares. I think I calculated that Alibaba bought back 8% of its market cap over the last year or so.
Yep.
So there's that. And another thing is that some of these risks are a little bit overblown, or while they could materialize, would likely not materialize until the distant future. So if you take the capital controls thing, well, this is something that would be most likely to occur in the event of a war between China and Taiwan. But we have Pentagon sources saying that China doesn't have the capacity to take Taiwan now. Furthermore, if they were to try to take Taiwan militarily, the extreme U.S. response, because the U.S. depends on Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing for its computer chips, the U.S. response would be extreme in the near term, which leads me to think that if China were to try to take Taiwan, it would be in the more distant future, probably 5 or more years out, at a point where they feel they're militarily capable of doing it, and where the U.S. response would not be as extreme as it is now.
Okay, so for a lot of people, let's say here, right, even with all of the things that you just outlined, the fact that they're cheap, some people will say, well, I can find good value in Canada or in the United States, so why should I consider still maybe diversifying and investing there? What would you say to people who ask that?
Well, my reason for it would be basically just the classic argument for diversification, which is spreading your eggs into different baskets, and more importantly, uncorrelated baskets. I mean, you can certainly tell that the Chinese markets are not super strongly correlated with North American markets these days. It's
That's true.
unprecedented U.S. bull run and the moderate Canadian bull run. Chinese stocks have not been doing well. So the correlation, when you invest in China, you're reducing the correlation in your portfolio. And for any listeners who aren't familiar with the concept of correlation in investments, basically, you reduce your risk when the returns on any one asset in your portfolio are not correlated with the returns on the other asset, because it means that they're not going to be moving in the same direction all the time, and that should smooth out your results. And so it provides for a less volatile portfolio. And people often think of diversification as the number of stocks in your portfolio, but in reality, if you want to have exposure to, let's say, U.S. energy, and you're a really good researcher, and you can find out every single risk factor impacting one U.S. energy stock, you probably can, with enough time, find a U.S. energy stock that'll do reasonably well. But what you do need, even if you're like the king of stock research, is different factor exposures and different sector exposures, because that's where your lack of correlation comes in. That's where the assets performing differently from one another comes in. Because really, I mean, if you invest in 500 different U.S. energy stocks, they're in all likelihood going to do this very similarly to one another.
All right.
Yes. So basically, from a classic portfolio management perspective, what China introduces to the portfolio is a lack of correlation, or a reduction of correlation between assets.
Yeah, and that's definitely an advantage. Okay, so I already know how you feel about this, and I know how I feel about this, but for our listeners, I have to ask, obviously, investing, it is at its core, it's a capitalist activity, right? and China
Yes.
is ruled, at least in name, by a communist party. So
Yeah.
how can one invest in a communist country? How does that work?
Well, you need to realize that the Chinese Communist Party has gone through a number of reforms over the years. It's not, China is no longer run by Maoism, which was like the extremely centrally planned ideology that took hold after the Chinese Communist Party won the war with the nationalist Kuomintang, who ended up becoming the government in Taiwan. And basically, what happened was they had a leader named Deng Xiaoping, who was, I mean, he, like the rest of them, he called himself a communist, but he was relatively liberal by the standards of Chinese communists at the time. And he introduced free market reforms. He encouraged Chinese citizens to go into business and try to get rich. He said being rich is glorious. And he basically paved the way for a market economy in China, which led to the Chinese system we have today. People sometimes call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. That
Hmm.
means there's a lot of Chinese cultural things in this form of socialism, such as Confucianism, but it also means kind of like a regulated market economy, an economy where basically people are free to start businesses, but the government regulates and intervenes when it feels it has to.
One thing, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Deng Xiaoping was actually inspired by Lee Kuan Yew to, you know Lee Kuan Yew, right? The
Yeah,
Singaporean.
Singapore, yeah.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And he, Lee Kuan Yew is credited for having turned Singapore from like, he called it the third world to first world in one generation, right? Singapore
Hmm.
as we know today. I don't know if you've been, I've traveled there. It's very nice.
I've never been there. No, I
Oh
haven't.
my God, it's like, so I grew up in Zurich, right, in Switzerland. It's like Zurich in Asia, basically.
Oh,
It's crazy.
wow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
crazy.
It's very cool. So anyway, yeah, Deng Xiaoping, I'm pretty sure he said he was inspired by what Lee Kuan Yew did, and that's kind of what he wanted to do in China, obviously with more government control still, but in terms
Okay.
of like the capitalistic pieces of it, that's what he did. So yeah, okay, good. I want your insight now on the state of China's economy today. I know we've heard of there has been some stimuluses and things like that, but what's going on in China now?
They are doing stimulus. This isn't exactly like a United States in 2020 when COVID happened, like extreme stimulus. But they are doing, I think it was last I heard, a package for something like 2.8 billion yuan, I think, worth of stimulus, which works out to several hundred billion, 2.8 trillion yuan,
Mm, right.
which works out to several hundred trillion billion in US dollar terms. This triggered a big rally around the end of last year, but it fizzled out when I think people didn't see as much consumption stimulus as they wanted, meaning stimulus that directly goes to the consumer.
Hmm.
But the latest reports say that the consumption stimulus will be coming. There's, of course, Trump taking office in about 8 days, and that people are expecting him to increase tariffs. I'm guessing he'll increase tariffs on some things, not increase them on the other things. However, the thing you need to remember is that China's trading relationships have gotten very diversified over the years, and if even if some relatively large sections of its exports to the U.S., we would imagine that the more sophisticated technologies they develop will not be getting into the U.S. market because that's what the U.S. military is targeting, for one thing, and it's also influencing business leaders' thoughts on what they want getting in to the U.S. market. So, for example, the solar panels are going to get huge tariffs. EVs already have an enormous 100% tariff, and I think Trump wants to raise that to
Oh,
200%.
wow.
And probably things like oh, I don't know, public infrastructure, that kind of
Mm,
stuff, like what
yes.
Huawei does, like telecom
Oh,
infrastructure,
yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
stuff.
That's all blocked. Yeah.
That kind of stuff from China won't be getting into the U.S. market anytime soon. However, smaller components that go into U.S. companies' products and kind of like dollar store products of the type that you buy on Temu, I
Yes.
have a feeling probably won't be getting tariffed. Because not a whole lot of U.S. companies do sort of those cheap dollar store type products, and so there's not much competition. I have a feeling that stuff is going to be mostly pretty safe.
Yeah, and I think the fact that China, even though obviously the relationship with the US is so important, but they've been building a lot of relationships with a lot of other countries, right, over time, and the BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative and all of these other things, right? So I think that even in the event of some kind of American decoupling, there's still
Mhm.
room for them to grow, right? What do you think?
Well, yes, I mean they're building, like you said, building relationships with so many other countries. Also, the decoupling with the United States. Well, what I think it's going to be is a decoupling of cooperation on advanced technologies primarily,
Hmm.
and I think this for two reasons. First of all, the thinking on the U.S.-China relationship is very heavily influenced by the military. And they don't want China getting access to the most advanced computer chips because
Hmm.
basically they don't want them having these chips in their military hardware. Second, the populists like Donald Trump, who are pledging to tariff China to bring jobs back to the United States, you have to think about what kinds of jobs these are. The jobs that pay salaries Americans would want. So, for that reason, a lot of these smaller trinket type items that China exports in the United States, like let's say like your pairs of socks on Temu,
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that kind of, uh, you
That's not
know,
the jobs he wants to bring back.
that kind of small manufacturing, I don't think anybody in the US even really cares to bring that
Yes.
kind of manufacture back to the US because it pays like $5 an hour.
Yeah.
So, I think that there will be still some trade in just like basic commodity goods.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. I guess now that's been a bit of a summary on China in general. Let's now dive into some of our companies. So as our listeners know, I hold just one Chinese stock right now, so I want to start with that one, and that is Alibaba, and I know you hold it too. So what I'd like you to do, if you're okay with it, is give for our listeners a bit of an overview first of what this company is and some of their main segments, because it's quite diversified.
Yeah, Alibaba is an enormously diversified e-commerce company. It is the largest e-commerce company in the world, not by revenue, but by gross transaction volume, which means the amount of trail of sales facilitated, because their model does not capture 100% of the sale as revenue, but it is the biggest in terms of how much global commerce it powers. And it has several segments. Its China domestic segment, it has Taobao, which is a shopping app similar to Temu. If you've ever used that, you just kind of flip through it on your phone to find products you want to purchase. It has Fresh Hippo, a grocery store chain. In its international segment, it has Alibaba.com, which is like a wholesale business where you can buy bulk goods, like let's say, I don't know, 500 knives and resell them in the
Oh
United
wow.
States. So that Alibaba wholesale is very big in drop shipping. And then it has AliExpress, which is Alibaba's kind of Temu-like app where customers can buy small products at cheap prices. And on top of that, it also has its non-e-commerce segments, like for example, cloud computing. It's the largest, I believe.
Exciting. Largest
Don't
in
quote me.
Asia. It's like
Yeah,
number three in the world, I think.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
a very big cloud computing segment, and that turned profitable in the last few years after several years of growing but not being profitable. So that's all very promising. It also famously has had an investments in many startups, too many to name, some of which weren't doing well and have been getting sold off. So Sun Art, for example, was sold off recently for 1.6 billion. These moves have been controversial because they sold out of some of them at losses. But I think in the long run, it'll free up more cash to focus on their core businesses. So I think selling off the massive collection of startups they've invested in is probably wise.
If I'll just quickly jump in, you know Joe Tsai, right? No, he's not CEO. He's the chairman, I think, right?
Yeah, he was
Uh,
CEO for a while, I
okay,
believe.
yeah. So there was this clip of him. It's probably about a year ago, talking about it's like a 25-minute video, and he's talking about their strategic like refocus, and he talked about this selling off non-core businesses, and it was exactly for the reason you mentioned. It's to free
Mhm.
up some capital, and so that they can be more focused on what matters most for them for the long term type of thing, right? Because I
Yeah.
think one of the big criticisms that they had and probably deserved is that they had a bit of a lack of focus. Because it's good to be
Yeah.
a conglomerate, but you also can't get lost in all the stuff that you're doing, right?
Yeah, for
So
sure.
yeah. So there's that. I'd like to hear your thoughts because you talked about cloud. And yeah, I was looking at some charts and I did see that they are starting to be profitable, which that's very exciting because as you know, cloud is really hard to be profitable in general, right? There's only a
Yes.
couple that are doing well in it, I think. How do you foresee the growth of their cloud business for the next few years? Like, do you think that might be one of the biggest growth drivers or more average? What do you think?
I'm expecting growth in the cloud has actually been kind of slow for the last few years because it got big in the past, and it just kind of hit a slowdown, I guess, with China's economy slowing down a bit.
Hmm.
But I expect the growth to accelerate. Although I will say this, I don't see it getting up to the level of growth that like international commerce is doing. Because in recent quarters, the international, like their Temu-like segment, that has been growing at like 40,
Mm.
30% year over year. I don't think it's going to accelerate back up to that kind of growth, but I think it'll get back to double-digit growth, especially since, I mean, they're getting clients in other countries and things like that now. So
Yeah,
it's
they
definitely
they
become,
did the Olympics. It was
yeah,
being
they
hosted
did.
on the like the Paris
Yes,
Olympics, right? Hosted
they
on the
did. Yeah.
Alibaba cloud. Like that's
Yeah.
listen for our listeners, right? Listen to that. They
Yeah, that
picked
was the big
Alibaba
deal.
to do that. When I saw that, I was like, what?
Yeah.
So yeah, okay, that's quite exciting. I guess you talked about buybacks. Let's also talk about dividends. So Alibaba for a long time was a company that paid no dividends, and now
Mhm.
they started, was it like what, a year ago or something?
It
Something
was
like that.
within some point in the last 2 years for sure.
So me personally, I don't care that much about dividends, but I think it's more of an indication of them trying to be more shareholder friendly, or at least show
Yeah,
that
for sure.
even if it's a communist country, they can still, return capital to shareholders. Like, what's
Yeah.
your thought on all of that?
Yeah, the dividends, I mean, they announced them and I received my payments. The narrative that people had about Finford is very obsessed with like the big name companies, right? And people are always saying, "Ah, China's a communist country. They'll never let you pay dividends." Well, I mean, Chinese banks and energy companies have been paying dividends for decades and decades and decades. I think that whole narrative that you may have seen on Finford was overblown right from the beginning.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's cool that Alibaba is now paying dividends. Like, when I think of where Alibaba is as a company and a stock right now, I think an all buyback return of wealth would probably make more sense. But I mean, the
Yes.
dividends are relatively small as a percentage of what they're doing, so it's okay.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I agree that at this depressed price, I think
Yeah.
buying back as much as they can would be great. But they're already, like you mentioned, they're buying a lot. Like I think it's the biggest buyback program I've ever seen in the last few years of any big company, right? In terms of
Yeah, as a
how the proportion, right, of how much they're buying.
yes, the percentage buyback. JD has another big one, yeah.
Okay,
But
right.
I don't know. You might not call JD a big company because while they do a lot of revenue, their market cap is
Medium.
only yeah,
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 medium big. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, actually, JD, that's a great pivot towards. I'd like to hear your thoughts on competition. Where does Alibaba sit in the competitive landscape, and what do you think of them potentially losing market share to others? Who are the others that they might lose market share to?
So the Chinese e-commerce space has definitely gotten more competitive. On the one hand, I guess in terms of direct competition, you have Alibaba, PDD, JD. Douyin, the Chinese equivalent of TikTok, has gotten into some social e-commerce lately. So there is competition in the China domestic market, and I think differentiation will be needed. As far as differentiation goes, I think PDD seems to have the most differentiated model because you see in China, they have a group buying model where people will like get together and they'll kind of like all agree to buy the same thing at the same time. Temu, which is the North American equivalent of Pinduoduo, doesn't actually have that, but that's something that they have in the Chinese market that differentiates them from Alibaba and JD. However, there are other areas where Alibaba has quite a strong competitive position. Notably, well, the cloud, I mean, they're number one in all of Asia, not just China, and also the international segment. First of all, none of Alibaba's Chinese competitors does anything similar to Alibaba International Wholesale. Alibaba International Wholesale is the business segment that facilitates large bulk purchases from Chinese suppliers by foreign businesses. So this is where you could buy things like cargo ships or like 500 knives or 500 computers. That particular segment of Alibaba has no parallel in JD, PDD, or TikTok or whatever you want to call it. Also, the international segment that is associated with AliExpress, which I mean, it's named different things in different countries, but that also, I think, has a better competitive position than Alibaba's domestic operations in some ways because it has the freedom to expand into different markets, get its foothold in those markets where other competitors haven't reached yet. And on a final note, the competition internationally between the Chinese e-commerce companies is largely just Alibaba and PDD because JD is almost entirely
Domestic,
domestic.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one thing I actually forgot to talk about this. Ant Financial, Ant Group. Alibaba still owns a
Yeah,
33% stake in that,
30%.
right? Okay, so let's talk about Ant because that's like I think it's the largest mobile digital payments company in the world by number of people.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. So let us know what is Ant Financial?
And Financial is Alibaba's payments app, and it is used to facilitate payments not only on the Alibaba ecosystem, but also just in stores all around China. Restaurants take it. It's very big. It's basically their equivalent of Apple Pay or Google Pay, but way more common. I mean, in China, hardly anyone uses credit cards. I hear anyways,
Mm.
and everyone's using either Alipay or WeChat Pay. So it's very, very big in payments in China.
It's like a super app too, because from what I understand, it's linked to
Yes.
your bank accounts, to your
Yeah.
insurance, to your credit score, to all kind to Uber, like their version of
Yes.
Uber, to like everything,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, that's so exciting. So if I recall, and that's where I think that, the communist control accusations kind of came for a good reason. Is like Ant Financial wanted to IPO in 2020, I think, and it was going to be the biggest IPO in the world, I think, something like
Yeah.
200 or 300 billion, like some crazy number. And then the Chinese regulators said no, but that was, I think, probably because Jack Ma was kind of like making fun of their banks or something.
Do you ever wonder why they still haven't allowed that IPO to go through?
I,
Because they're always saying they want to stimulate the stock market. And what could be a
right?
better catalyst
Yeah,
than to
I don't know.
finally, maybe it's like the last trick up their sleeve. Like when everything else has failed, we're going to allow the Ant Group IPO, and that'll, because that was
Yeah,
so symbolic
I
of when
know.
things went wrong in China, right? The Ant Group
Yes.
IPO getting canceled.
Yes. I mean,
Did you
I
know?
think, this is a point where, and I'm very much with you on the spectrum of, investable or not. I think China is investable, but it's certainly, their capital markets is not as sophisticated as here. They're still not as, focused. Like the market isn't as efficient as it is here and in the US, and they still have
Yeah,
a
for sure.
ways to go, I think. Though I know a lot of their, like even within the Communist Party, I think a lot of people think it's like one party and one thought, but there's a lot of debate internally, right? And within the party, there are some people that are more pro-business and some that are a bit less, right? And
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a constant tug of war. But my thoughts are, as China continues to grow in proportion within the world, right? They're going to have to open their markets more. Like they can't do this kind of stuff forever, right? Like trying to control everything because,
Mhm.
otherwise you're not going to attract foreign capital, which is what they're trying to do anyway, right? So
Yeah, they really want foreign investment. So,
yeah, and they're doing everything they can to get it in. So
yeah.
anyway, okay, so that was at Ant Financial. I guess now as a segue, let's talk about their bigger competitor, which you just mentioned a little bit, PDD Holdings. This is one that I think especially in the FinTwit space, right? It's kind of the new one that most people focus on a lot more than Alibaba, I think, and
Yeah.
for good reason because it's grown a lot. So tell us a bit about that growth. Like what, I mean, you already said, I guess, what sets them apart with their kind of group buying thing, but what else
Yeah.
do they do? Yeah, how does it work?
So PDD Holdings is best known in the West as the owner of Temu. Well, actually, I don't know if people know that it's the owner of Temu, but its best known business in the West is Temu, which is the cheap discount app where you can find all kinds of goods like socks and knives and SD cards and anything you want. And in China, they have an equivalent of that, which is called Pinduoduo, which also has an added group purchasing feature, kind of similar to Groupon, if you remember that, that differentiates it in the Chinese market. They've been rapidly expanding all over the world. They made a big push into the US market. We're the number one downloaded app on the App Store for over a year. And the way they grew is they invested a lot in advertising. So much more than Alibaba, for example, was at the time. So they gained a lot of ground over AliExpress in foreign markets. And they were growing at just lightning fast rates, like, 100 to 200% year over
Insane.
year in
Yeah.
revenue. In the most recent quarter, that slowed down a bit. The year over year growth rate was still extremely high. However, the quarter over quarter growth rate, revenue only grew 2% and earnings actually went down a bit. So there's some pressure on their margins from, well, competition in the Chinese market, for one thing. And also in international markets, they're having to advertise a lot to achieve their growth. Because they locked in a customer base in the United States, they're somewhat free to cut down on the advertising spending there now. But then that raises the question, will they be able to keep the customers there? On the whole, I mean, I still have Alibaba, PDD is probably my third biggest Chinese
Oh,
holding,
okay. Wow.
and I still own like a not insignificant percentage of my portfolio in it. However, I did sell a chunk of that the last time it ran up during that China
Hmm. The rally?
stimulus rally because I was a little bit about the decelerating growth, but I still I'm still pretty optimistic about it in the long run, and I'll definitely be holding my PDD shares at least until the next earnings release comes out.
Good to know. From what I understand, I don't know PDD as well as the others, but I hear that they had a strategy of focusing on lower tier cities. Can you explain
Yeah.
what that is? Like what the strategy is and what is a lower tier city in China? Like what does that even mean?
That's their strategy in China. That has no, I mean that has nothing to do with what they're doing in the Western countries.
Hmm.
But in China, I mean, they started off as an agricultural group buying service, and they would facilitate people buying produce and other, I guess, grocery store goods from local farmers. And it mostly focused on lower tier cities because, well, for one thing, I mean, it's a smart thing for a Chinese company to do now because China wants to promote agriculture, rural development, sorry.
Hmm.
And also because it was where agriculture was what they got their started. It just makes sense because that's where the farmers are.
Okay, another question I had for you. This is an interesting one. As you know, we both own Brookfield. You still own Brookfield, I think, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay,
yes.
so Brookfield has,
I
a lot.
increased
Oh,
my
you did.
Brookfield position.
Oh,
I
nice.
did,
Okay.
yeah.
We can talk about that after, but I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So from our ownership in Brookfield, we know there are a lot of, accusations sometimes of like weird financial reporting or stuff like that. So as I was preparing
Yes.
for our chat today on PDD, I came across some stuff about PDD being a little bit weird too. Like they don't have a CFO or something like that. So I just wanted to ask you just to break down this whole discussion because I don't know much about that, and also explain: are you concerned about it, or is it a Brookfield situation where it's people who don't really know and they're just like making weird comments? What do you think?
Okay, so Brookfield and PDD are sort of similar in that they have people questioning their financial reporting. However, the similarities about end there because the concern with PDD is the complete opposite from Brookfield. It's not that their reports are complex or anything. It's that they're as skimpy as possible,
Ah,
as light on information as possible. Now, Brookfield discloses everything. I mean, you can find basically any detail on any part of the company you could ever want. With PDD, a lot of information investors would want isn't in the reports. Specifically, they don't break out earnings by geographic segment. So, like for
mhm.
example, if you would, they've been investing so much money into Temu, growing Temu with these huge ad buys, and we know that they're spending lots of money because you can just look at how many you can look at the meta platforms and Google ad
Yeah.
campaigns they've run to
Oh,
know
it's
it's billions
everywhere.
and billions of dollars, but they don't actually list on the financial report US revenue, US ad spend, things like that.
Okay.
Investors would want to see, but they're not seeing it. So that's where the accounting concerns with PDD Holdings come in. It's not complexity or anything. It's, I guess, what you call a lack of transparency. There's not as
Hmm.
much information as investors would want.
Is it because they don't want competitors to know about it?
Yes, because that is one of the reasons why they don't want
Uh,
competitors knowing too much about their model.
yeah, fair. And so for you as a shareholder, does it bother you? Are you okay with it? Like, what do you think?
I don't think that PDD Holdings is cooking the books. The main reason being that like what they say that you look at the reports, the picture they present is a lot of revenue growth, a lot of earnings growth. And then you look at over the last couple of years, the growth of Temu in the well, I mean, over the last few years, you started seeing all of your friends and family members starting to use Temu. You started seeing Temu advertised all over the place.
Hmm.
So the on the ground reality with Temu is consistent with what shows
Yes,
up in
that's
PDD's
true.
reports.
I know so many people who use it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I still well basically Temu has replaced for me for small like sort of like throwaway purchases kind of replaced the dollar stores. Like when I
Uh,
want to get like just some cheap pairs of socks or cheap little knickknacks, I usually go to Temu. Yeah, so I think what you see with Temu on the ground is consistent with what's in PDD's reports, and also last quarter where they showed the decline in earnings. If they were cooking the books, why would they show that? I mean,
yeah,
I
they would just keep it going up
wouldn't
all
they
the
want to
time.
make it look artificially good?
Hmm. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's not a luck and coffee situation, you don't
I
think?
don't think so.
No.
No.
Okay. For people who don't know, Luckin Coffee was this company that they did fabricate a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then the news came out, the stock fell like 80%. I think it's the company still exists, right? It's still a big coffee chain.
I believe so, yeah. But they
Yeah.
got delisted from the US, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. They
But
got in trouble.
they're still like huge in China as far as I
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
fun. Let's move on to your last Chinese holding, which is the Postal Savings Bank of China. So I know zero about this one, so I need you to give us the entire summary of what is this bank? What do they do? Why is it a better bank than other Chinese banks for you?
Okay, this one is actually really simple. The Chinese banks are just cheap as hell, right? Like 0.5 times book value,
Oh, wow.
three or four times earnings,
Oh,
6, 7% dividend yields, all of those characteristics of like deep value stocks. However, the concern is the Chinese property sector. The Chinese property sector has been struggling for years and years. There's been some signs of recovery, but a lot of these loans have gone into default and banks have lost money on them. The thing with Postal Savings Bank is it doesn't have many loans to these commercial real estate developers. It's only 3% of its loan book is
oh,
to commercial real estate developers, which is the
that's
lowest
very little.
of
Yeah.
the Chinese banks. Yeah, lowest of the big Chinese banks. And it's also involved in rural banking, which is an area that the Chinese party wants to support. So it just has those advantages over the other Chinese banks in that it's not as exposed to the biggest risk factor in China at the moment. And it also is catering to a customer base that China's government is trying to support.
Okay, so to summarize then, deep value, lower risk with the commercial real estate
Yeah.
and involved in the parts that the party is putting a lot of
Yes.
money in because they want to develop. Okay, that's a
Yes.
very good thesis summarized in one sentence too. Okay, so because I was gonna ask you too about like fintech competition, but I guess there's not that much because they really differentiate themselves in that area with their focus, right? So there's not much of a fear around.
Yeah, also, I mean, there's also an element of partnership between the Chinese banks and the Chinese fintechs, and that, I mean, in many cases, when people pay with Alipay, they're paying from their bank balance and things like that. So it's not life or death competition, I don't think.
Okay, I see. And how, so they've done their stimulus not too long ago. Maybe they might do another one. How do you feel a stimulus might benefit or impact the bank?
Well, I mean, the stimulus is going to result in lower interest rates, which in principle is not a good thing for banks. And I would imagine as a result of that, the Postal Savings Bank probably won't do a whole lot of growth when it reports its earnings next. But I don't think it's going to like start losing money because of the lower interest rates or anything, because there are all these offsetting mechanisms. Like with lower interest rates, people become more willing to borrow and they can make it up on volume and things like that. So yeah, I don't see the stimulus being a huge catalyst for Postal Savings Bank like it would be for the other two we discussed, but
Okay.
I don't see it being a big harm to it either.
Okay. Another thing too, and I guess this is a great segue, and then we'll talk about Brookfield for a little if you don't mind. That would be great.
Okay, sure.
But thinking of so Brookfield, as you know, right? They've traded at this big discount all the time, and now you can see them really doing a bunch of stuff to try and create that value to expand the multiple, right? So spinning off the BAM and trying to move
Yeah.
BAM to the US, that kind of stuff. So do you think is there anything like that this Chinese bank is trying to do? Like to expand that multiple for higher than like 5 times PE? Like, are there any catalysts that you can see, or is it more one where it's deep value and it might stay there for a while, but maybe not? Like, what do you think?
They're not going to be like spinning off any subsidiaries or anything like that. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward organization. It's a bank that has bank branches, and then that's about it for Postal Savings Bank. But well, in my view, the main benefit of Postal Savings Bank is the extreme cheapness. Not that it's going to be like this enterprise that grows dramatically and takes over the world or anything. It's just real
Right.
cheap. And I mean,
Yeah.
your dividend return on this stock, I mean, even after the withholding tax is taken out, is about 6%. And I mean,
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
yeah, I've been collecting that dividend reliably. And of course, the stock price has gone up some too. And I think that if there's a rotation, as I think there's going to be out of these really pricey tech names into more value names, I think that could lead to some multiple expansion. But to answer your question, are they doing things actively to get multiple expansion going like Brookfield is? No, not really that I'm
Oh,
aware of.
okay. Yeah. And I know you've probably looked a little bit at Fairfax, but your strategy with this Chinese bank is exactly what Prem Watsa from Fairfax, his strategy was with Greek banks, where he, right after the Greek, 2011 crisis, I was still in Europe back then. I can tell you it was
Yeah,
bad. Like people
yeah,
were not happy with Greece. people were scared that Greece would destroy the entire euro currency, right? And right at
Yeah,
that moment, Prem Watsa was like, "Oh, I should start buying Greek banks because it was trading at like 3, 4 times
yeah.
earnings, which is insane, right?" And he's made big gains on his
You
bank.
know what? I've heard, this is just something I've heard in the media. Like, I haven't looked
Yeah,
at the numbers or anything, but I've heard that Greece is doing kind of okay
it's
now.
doing amazing
Be-
now.
Because
Yes,
they're so big in shipping, and all this international
yes,
instability is
yes.
leading to higher shipping rates. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, dude, the transformation, like every time I read about Greece, I'm like, oh my God, they're actually doing like they have
Yeah.
good, like European growth in general is very low, right? So they don't have
Yeah.
6% growth, but they're growing faster than the EU average. They're
Yeah.
like they have a government. He's been there for like what 5 years. It's a bit more pro-business government. It's not
Yeah.
like radical. It's not like the Argentinian president, but it's more like
Yeah.
like just responsible policy. Try to cut the deficit and
Right.
have these value creation opportunities, all this kind of stuff. So the Greek stock market has been doing really well, and
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
that makes total sense because Greece is, well, just look at what we've had the Ukraine war, we've
hmm
had the Israel Palestine,
yep,
Israel Lebanon war, and we had the situation with the Houthis in the Red Sea. And the Greek shipping companies, they benefit off all this instability because
they're reliable.
the more that the routes have to be rerouted to longer routes, the more money they collect, and that's such a huge part of the Greek economy is shipping.
Yeah. Oh no,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. So they're doing great. So I'm anyway. Your strategy with China made me think of Fairfax. So if you still
Yeah.
don't own it, you don't necessarily
Yeah,
have to buy it, but look into it.
I've looked into it a little bit, but I
Look
mean,
into
it's
it.
what I have learned from looking at Fairfax is this, though, is that they own a lot of insurance companies all over North America, and there's a lot of different pieces to look at to really understand the company. So
Yes.
it is going to take
It's
some
it's a
research.
lot of homework. And honest, I mean, I already own it, but I'm still learning about it
Yeah.
even after, which isn't the best strategy, but it's okay.
Mm.
But the good thing is they also own insurance companies like globally as well, right? They're also in the UK and
Yes.
Middle
Yes.
East and stuff. Because I was scared too. I was like, oh my God, if they're just in the US, what if they're all in Florida and Florida gets a hurricane and then they all collapse
Yeah.
at the same time? But it's broader than just there, right? So anyway, okay. Let's have your Brookfield update. Wasn't on the schedule, but I would love to hear because you said you just added recently. So what was the thinking behind that?
Well, this was on Friday when you remember markets were just collapsing like
Oh
crazy
yes,
all over the place,
yes, yeah,
and
yeah.
I just had that idea. Like I was thinking, I think I might want to buy some things here, and there's a number. I've been focusing on value stocks lately. I've been moving out of U.S. tech and into value. The latest thing I moved into was energy. However, on that day, energy stocks were really rallying.
Yeah.
So I decided not to add to those positions. I mean, this oil tanker shipping company that I invested in recently, Torm PLC, that was up 7% on Friday. So
Wow.
that was not a dip buy situation. So I wasn't going to buy the energy stocks, but I looked at the Chinese stocks. They were down that day when the concern was, U.S. yields. And I thought, why should the Chinese stocks be affected by this? So they were on the list to consider. Second, Brookfield was down a whole bunch because it has, a lot of
6%.
leverage, and
Yeah.
that became number one on my list because I didn't think that yields this high are going to last. I mean, the bond market vigilantes or whoever are driving this, they're fighting the Fed. Now, I don't think the Fed's going to go lowering rates to 0% or anything like that, like in the old days, but I think they're
Mhm.
going to basically stay the course, maybe do minor interest rate cuts. So I don't think the concern, because people are concerned about the effect of higher rates on Brookfield, but I
Yes.
don't think the yields are going much higher than they are now. So, and of those three I bought, by the way, Brookfield, PDD, and JD. Brookfield was the biggest by far.
Oh.
I invested like a pretty substantial chunk of my net worth into Brookfield that day, but only small, kind of minor amounts into the other two. So yeah, so Brookfield is probably one of, if not my biggest holdings. It's either number
Ah.
one or number two now. Yeah,
Oh, damn. Okay, join the club. Yeah, that's
yeah.
that's nice. Yeah, man, I'm a big fan of this company, as you know, right?
Mhm.
I'm entering. This is my 6th year now owning it, and it's good. The hardest was obviously like COVID and like 2023. They had that big dip, which was a great time to buy. I think that's when you started buying
I
too.
did buy during that dip, although
Yeah.
I'm always wishing that I had bought a bit lower into the dip because
Mm.
I bought when it was already on the way to recovery. But I mean,
Okay.
nevertheless, I mean,
Yeah. Oh, I bought so much. It literally around like 40 Canadian dollars is what I was buying. So which was near the low of the dip. So that
yeah,
was
I think my
that's good.
initial My initial thing with Brookfield was around 50 Canadian.
Okay, yeah, which is still great,
And
great
yeah.
value. Yeah, I really think that there's potential. Obviously, not no investing advice, but I think if they execute their plan and the valuation stays more or less the same, I think it could be a double-ish in like 5 years or so, something
Yeah,
like
and if you look at all the operational things that are going on with the company, I mean, obviously you got to look at earnings and how things go, but
that.
they're doing that big deal with Qatar, they're doing the deal with Brookfield
Yep.
Renewables, doing the deal with Microsoft. I mean, obviously there's going to be a huge, huge amount of revenue coming in from all of these things. So I mean, the signs are looking good now for sure.
Yeah, very exciting. Okay, are there any last pieces of advice or last interesting ideas that you have that you'd like to share today?
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. I learned a lot from you again. I'm always happy to chat
Thanks.
with you. And yeah, I can't wait to share this conversation with everybody.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much.